Dr. MIRJANA ROKSANDIC, thanks so much for coming on to Evolutionsoup all the way from your home in Manitoba, Canada. You are a professor and paleoanthropologist at the University of Winnipeg, and your main interests focus upon Pleistocene hominin evolution in Europe, asking the big questions as to when, how, and why humans have moved across the vast expanses of land and sea. You're also known for your work with recent Evolutionsoup guest, Christopher Bay, on the proposed species name Homo Bodoensis, which we'll be talking about today. Welcome to the show, MIRJANA. Well, it's been a few years since the Bodoensis name was proposed and published, and people are still talking about it.
Well, I do hope they continue talking about it. I also hope that they actually read the paper a little bit more thoroughly when they do, because lots of times we are cited, because I guess it's unavoidable to cite something that has been newly published and stuff like that. But I find that in many instances, the understanding of what we are trying to propose and what we are trying to do with this paper is somehow sort of lacking. It's just superficially read. The name is there, but not the essence of it.
Before we dive into the world of Bodoensis, let's just hear a little bit about your background. MIRJANA, where did you grow up, and what interests and fascinations led you to the work you're doing now?
I grew up in a country that doesn't exist anymore. It was Yugoslavia. It was beautiful and big and quite independent. And then in the 90s, we moved to Canada. I studied at different places in France and in Canada, in former Yugoslavia. And I worked a lot in different archaeological settings and with lots of different, how would I put that, intellectual traditions. So my questions are always somewhat like the big important questions. This is what fascinates me and what gets me interested and going. And then you go into details, because the devil is in the details, right? Your big important questions can only be answered based on that. I started off at the University of Belgrade in archaeology because I was one of those lucky kids that in 80s, there was a shift towards some kind of a weird idea of training high school students towards some kind of applicable discipline. And I ended up going into museum conservation studies, which was supposed to give me a job right after I finished the high school, which of course never happens, because how many museum conservators do you actually have in any country? So what happened is that we were really spoiled with the choice of subjects that we could pursue. And we looked into archaeology, museology, logic, sociology, like all sorts of like topics that you can dwell into human condition, ethnography as well, etc., etc. And of course, museum conservation, which I loved because it's hands-on. You get to piece things together. You get to glue them, reconstruct them, and restore them. And so in many cases, this was like real beauty of the practical experience at the National Museum of Belgrade at the time. Now it's National Museum of Serbia. And so from that, I also was invited to go into an archaeological field as a conservator. And my first experience in archaeology started before I actually got into the university, because what I wanted to do is go into art school. And of course, art school is more than just your talent and art. It's also persistence. They never take you in after the first try. So I failed, of course, and failed miserably. And my act was floating a little bit in the space, so they didn't take me seriously. And so I decided that, yeah, that's it for art. It just requires way too much persistence and like when you do art, you have to do art and nothing else in your life. But for me, archaeology, like we had a really inspired professors at the University of Belgrade, Dragoslav Srejovic, Milutin Garashin. And these were two people that actually shaped how I perceived archaeology. Dragoslav Srejovic was, I don't know, he was probably a shaman in his previous life. Like this guy knew intuitively so much more that could be explained on a scientific basis. And Milutin Garashinin was the opposite. For him, the systematics, the scientific basis, the structure were everything. So these two people really shaped how I started thinking about archaeology as a subject, right? But then I was really like, culture, it's all good, but I need some biology. Like I need some sort of, something to literally lay your hands on and dwell deeper into. And for me, humans are not just culture, not just biology. They are actually both, right? And of course, I was, as everyone else, interested in evolution. And Paleolithic archaeology was really not very well represented in Serbia at the time, or Yugoslavia in general. And I decided to go into this really deep past. And then for my Diplôme des études approfondies, which I got in Bordeaux, I decided to work on Neanderthals. And so it's really funny because I defended my master thesis on Neanderthal sexual dimorphism in Serbia, which was completely crazy because there was no one actually who did Neanderthals at the time. But on the other hand, I did some cremation burials from Serbia for my DIA in Bordeaux. So, like, if you look into what I did in my career, it's all over the place. And it's because I'm interested in the questions that somehow haven't been answered or haven't been even asked. University de Bordeaux was one of the best schools you could possibly go for human evolution, and especially Neanderthals, because they had a lot. They had, Neanderthals from France, and the Professor Van der Merch, he actually did also the study in Israel, in Kavse, and we had access to lots of both original materials, but also research-worthy casts. It was a very vibrant, fantastic kind of laboratory to work with. But what really set the stage for me there is the interest that they had in not promoting one particular view on human evolution. And Van der Merch was very good at not forcing you to be one of his graduate students. Do you understand what I'm saying? It's like, I find that lots in North America that the opinions of student generations to come are framed by their supervisors. And it's really hard to break that mold after a while. And some people do. I mean, they come with new ideas, new perspectives. But that was I think the biggest thing I got from Université de Bordeaux and from Professor Van der Merch and my direct supervisor, who was Dominique Gambier. Oh, she's late now. And so, yeah, after that, the war in Yugoslavia started. It was not my war. So we moved to Canada. And I did my PhD at SFU, which was also very interesting because this was the first department where archaeology was very science-based. So it was not just, it was not post-processual as the fashion was at the time. It was not processual as the fashion was before then. It was really looking for answers at the intersection of science and social sciences. And I think that was the real big boost to my understanding. And also, it introduced me to all the issues that of colonial science and stuff like that, which is not something that many Europeans were aware of at the time, or even now. My European colleagues are sometimes really clueless about these things, even though, Western Europe was very much involved in colonial science and colonial archaeology. So, lots of different, I think that, really what I'm trying to get my students to do is to go to different places, interact with different intellectual traditions, because much that they think that we are the center, everything else is the periphery of the science. There is lots to be learned from scientific approaches of very different people and places. So I think I pretty much told you what my life was all about.
In 2021, you and your colleagues proposed a new and clarifying species name, Homo bodoensis, for hominin representing the immediate ancestor of modern humans. Mirjana, can you set the scene for us as to why you and your colleagues realized that this needed to be done?
Okay, so it goes back to my first fossil find, which is a Malabalanica mandible from Serbia, which just doesn't fit or didn't fit at the time with any of the models in human evolution that were current, and could not be a Neanderthal, although in Europe, as we knew it, everything was a Neanderthal before that. So in one of the papers, we named it Homo heidelbergensis sensulata. My first paper, I named it Homo species because basically we couldn't determine where it belongs to. And calling it Homo heidelbergensis sensulata was basically because one of my co-authors insisted that it be Homo heidelbergensis. And I said, no, it cannot be Homo heidelbergensis, only if it is sensulata, which is a nonsensical term in paleoanthropology, but we'll get to that later. So then I was curious about what is actually a Homo heidelbergensis, if we want to define it or redefine it, what it should be like. So we looked into primitive versus derived traits in Neanderthals, modern humans, and Middle Pleistocene hominins, and came up, this was done by myself and my 2 PhD students, and was actually, I was invited by Chris and Serene Elzatari and Katerina Harvati to present at the conference or a session that was dedicated to places that weren't well known, right? Like what happens in the evolution in places that we're not concentrating on in archaeology, in paleoanthropology. So for that paper, we looked into traits, when they appear, how they appear, what is primitive, what's derived, etc., etc. Instead of looking into individual species and comparing the well-preserved ones, we scored the traits for everything, right? Like we scored whatever find was as to primitive and derived traits and where they belong, right? And came up with a solution that most of the primitive traits are apparent in the Eastern Europe, and derived traits for Neanderthals are apparent in Western Europe. And so this is a very different kind of understanding of how to, it was really for the lack of complete specimens that we could actually discuss, but we were looking at, what kind of traits show up and where, and what could they potentially signify. So for me, Eastern Mediterranean, so you're looking into the Balkans, you're looking into north of Black Sea, you're looking into the western coast of South Asia, so basically in Southwest Asia. So Southeast Europe to Southwest Asia, geography does play a very significant role. It's not a determinist role, but it's a very significant role in shaping human and animal interactions and movements and everything else. So, this whole area shows more primitive traits, maybe because they didn't actually need to develop any derived traits. And the population was big enough so that the derived traits would just melt into this general population, which stays primitive, right? And when I say primitive, like 5 hands of a human is primitive, while one finger of a horse is a derived trait. So it doesn't have this value that we associated with primitive versus modern, right? So after looking into that, we looked into Homo heidelbergensis, and then Chris and I decided that we were going to have a session at American Association of Biological Anthropologists in Cleveland. And in that session, we invited people who work on this particular topic, and Middle Pleistocene in particular, and what was known as muddle in the middle. And after inviting all of them and working with all of them, we came to the realization that, I mean, there is no hope for Homo heidelbergensis, even if we defined it as I did, as an Eastern European, Eastern Mediterranean phenomenon, rather than when you have Neanderthals in Europe and everything in Europe is leading to a Neanderthal. This is actually something else. It still didn't make any sense, right? And no one was buying into it. So Chris, myself, Predrag, who was on my poster, and Shijue Wu, who was on Chris's poster for that session, the 4 of us decided to write a paper clarifying what we actually came up with. And the fact is that Homo bodoensis didn't come out of we didn't write the paper with a goal in mind. We were actually, this was the very interesting, productive 6 months of work on, writing one paragraph. What do we want to say? Like, what are we going to look into? And putting it into like a framework. Then we would write and disagree and rewrite and agree and then rework. And it actually came as a result of the process of thinking. So it really is a very interesting way of structuring the paper. At some point, Chris was like, oh, we should just name a new species. This makes no sense. Like Homo heidelbergensis is just going nowhere. Like Homo heidelbergensis, what it became is a wastebasket term, right? You don't know what it is. It is Middle Pleistocene. If it's Middle Pleistocene, it is Homo heidelbergensis sensulato, okay? And with sensulato meaning in the very wide open sense, which basically in taxonomy means wastebasket term, right? You don't know what it is, you call it this because it fits geologically into a time slot, right? Once that was clear, we decided that we should look for possible, let's say, in Africa, especially because I was suspecting that my Balanica mandible has nothing to do with the European population. It has to do with Southwest Asian, possibly African origin. And so what do I call it? And in the first paper, I was looking for what are the species names that are appropriate for Africa. And the first species obviously comes Homo rhodosiensis. And I was like, ugh. Honestly, talking about human evolution and linking it to Rhodes, who was an explicit racist, and even to Woodward and other English colleagues at the time who were explicit racists. I mean, there's no doubt. Piltdown Man was also endorsed by them. A Piltdown hoax, if you want to put it better. So, it just didn't make sense. Not at that time when I was writing that paper in 2008 or 2009, and not, 20 years or 10 years later when we were starting to wrap our heads around. And lots has happened since 2009 when I was writing my first paper on Balanica. In 2020, tons of things have happened in the science and paleoanthropological science that actually we can talk about later. So this is the thing, right? So it did make sense to use rhodesiensis, and we were like, okay, let's look into the previous names, lots of names. Every species gets a name. And none of these names stuck, right? Because of the priority of rhodesiensis, but also because there's lots of issues with different names. We can get into that. Taxonomy is a man-made decision. It's a language, right? So it carries information about systematics. And it carries the information, and then it carries a name, which is a nomina, which is nomenclature. So taxonomy is systematics and nomenclature and its own field of taxonomy. So you can imagine it as a triangle, right, in which each of these things is very important for it. But none of them is the same. They're all very much connected, but they're not the same things. So it becomes really complicated to talk about an individual species or a system or any other taxonomic unit when you're not clear about what you're talking about in terms of systematics and then in terms of nomenclature. So I don't know if it makes sense, but biology is extremely complicated. And when you look into how taxonomy came about, it is a pre-evolutionary science. So it had the goal of describing the living world, which it did really well. And binomial nomenclature is a fantastic tool for describing the world. But as every tool, it eventually becomes either dull, inapplicable to a new model, or inapplicable to a different way of thinking. So taxonomy did not have evolution in mind. And evolution has very different constraints, and especially paleontology and paleoanthropology have very different constraints than examining modern species. So this is where it's really important to develop this tool to fit the system we're trying to fit it into. And I think it's probably one of the messages of our paper. We have to do something about the naming that actually makes it more, that makes a tool of communication of a very complex subject can be reduced to, let's say, ideational, sort of nomenclature issues, but that clarify rather than obfuscate, right? It's very difficult to talk about human evolution in simple terms. And that's why you have all these, this changes everything. And this is a new, anthropologists don't agree with each other. We agree. I mean, most of the times we agree on all the basic premises of evolution and human lineages and stuff like that. But we disagree in details. We examine different details. We actually try to improve our understanding by this stepwise correction, proposal, and so on and so on. That's how science functions. So taxonomy is very important, but it's not a God world, right? It's not something, the principles of taxonomy are not written in stone. I mean, the ICZN, which is International Commission on Zoological Nomenclature, has actually had lots of different stepwise process in improving taxonomy and nomenclature. So we have to allow that community to improve even further.
The name Bodoensis derives from a 600,000-year-old fossil skull found in Ethiopia in 1976. Mirjana, can you tell us about the discovery of this skull and why it's so important to the research you're doing now?
This was discovery made by John Kalb in 1976 when he was one of these crazy enthusiast. Like he was quite an interesting character. His book on basically his memoir of that time is very much worth reading. I think it's a delightful piece of information, and there's lots of detail on geology of the area and on the finds themselves. So it's really worth looking at. Um, Bodo came about because it fitted the right geology, the right time slot. It also fitted the right kind of um, morphology. And here we come with the devil, right? Morphology is, the phenotype is only one of the things that that takes that is important in defining a species, right? In paleontological context, this is all we have: morphology, right? We do have some genetics and now some proteomic stuff that can tell us something about, sort of speciation process, et cetera, et cetera. And but it doesn't go geologically in geological terms deep enough. Also, in terms of geography and preservation, for example, Eastern African specimens are just too complicated. DNA is too degraded. Even proteomes are not 100% promising because of the geological conditions in which they were buried. So it's kind of, we are, as I said, like the science behind it, it has to be multifaceted. So you have multi-proxy. So you're using, basically, we have so little information from each individual piece that you have to use every bit of information to sort of click into each other and make a reasonable picture. And then that reasonable picture can actually lead you to propose a reasonable model. And that model can lead you, can be tested. And then you can actually figure out whether it holds water, doesn't hold water, what's going to happen next. So when we wrote the piece about Bodoensis, it wasn't necessarily giving the answer, but it was asking the question. It was actually prompting people to discuss these issues, to to discuss taxonomy, to discuss systematics that we're trying to work on, and discuss the position we have as to human origins, because regardless of the fact that we belong to zoological context, we come with a set of constraints that are far more far-reaching, if you want, in a sense of communicating the science and the interest people have in human origins. Like, very few people are interested in the origins of horses, right? But every single one is interested in origins of humans, even if they consider it some non-scientific ideas or ideological positions. They're still interested in in the and in their own origins. We have genealogies, we have all sorts of things that speak to that, and the popularity of your evolutionary soup also speaks to that, right? So a little plug-in. So what I was, what we were trying to do is look at the perfect candidate that meets the. So we first thought about Kabwe as an example of this, but Kabwe's dating is problematic, and it just didn't fit exactly where we wanted it. So we were suggesting maybe just change Rhodesiensis to Kabwensis, which would have been a relatively, I think it would have come with much more, less discussion, less attention as well, but maybe easier to pass, right? Just on basic ethical terms, we changed the name from Broken Hill to Kabwe. We changed the name from Rhodesiensis to Kabwensis. Might have been basically easier to justify. But Kabwe didn't fit the time period that was actually of interest to us. In terms of morphology, This is something that's very difficult in such a polymorphic species that humans are. But also, it becomes difficult in terms of what does actually a paleoanthropological species mean? We have seen, and that's I was telling you about the development since 2010, when at the same time and independently, Rebecca Ackerman published a paper on hybridization between different baboon groups, what are the expected phenotypical reactions to hybridization between different groups. And then she came up with human individuals, hominins, basically from Europe, so from Krapina, basically, and also from Southwest Asia, that could bear witness to hybridization between modern humans and Neanderthals. And that was quite fantastic, especially because it puts it in very early, late Pleistocene. And at the same time, you had these two papers that talk about, one about Denisovan and another about the mandible, again from Balkans, from Romania, that actually demonstrated that there was hybridization between Neanderthals and modern humans, which was a no-no until then by geneticists, especially Svante Pääbo. And no matter, this is one of those things when there is a prevalent model in paleoanthropology, it blinds us to all the other possibilities that exist. And even though lots of people actually had other possibilities to offer, the prevalent model was so strong that it was impossible to publish, or it was just relegated to, like secondary literature on the topic. Once the hybridization model came out as a possibility and the idea that there was interaction between these groups, well, that opened up all this pent-up energy, in the field that actually now had a potential to actually get out, even though it was existing before. So Bodo fitted the bill because it was 600,000 years old. It was, in some ways, it's a difficult skull because it's extremely robust. So some of the morphological features, especially the pneumatic face and stuff like that, are kind of hard to evaluate. But it shows what we were aiming for is a suite of derived, basically primitive, derived, and shared-derived traits, which are very important in how you structure, in cladistic terms, how you structure your systematics or your phylogeny, right? When you look in the Middle Pleistocene hominins, you have two trademark developments. One is enlarged brain. The second one is reduced dentition. Both of them are, to have such a large brain, you need a lot of food. To process lots of food, you need big dentition. So basically, the bigger the animal, the bigger the teeth, the bigger the brain, right? Well, with humans, it's not the case. We're doing an opposite. So it means that something is interfacing between the big brain and allowing for the reduction of dentition. And that is the cultural adaptation. So humans, if you want, are slightly different from other animals because we have externalized our adaptation. It's no longer just our body. Certainly, our body adapts, reacts, and changes, right, over time. But there is something underlying that is mitigating that change, making it, if you want, slower, and making these species or these group of different hominins either you lump them all together and says, like, okay, since Homo erectus, when we started developing big brains, we are all one species. And I was actually quite fond of that idea back in the 90s. I was thinking, okay, well, none of these models that were proposed out of Africa are multi-regional. In the 90s, they were all the rage, okay? But they didn't make sense in terms of logic, okay? Because if out of Africa was right, then how do you explain the big brains in other hominins, right? In non-African hominins that existed in the region before Africans came in. If multi-regional was right, then, like, you could not have these different species. You had to have just one species developing over a large period of geological time, but also in very many different geographical areas. And what is really fascinating to me is that back in the 80s, I think, or it was back in the late 90s, Fred Smith proposed out of Africa with modification. Yes, there was out of Africa, where all humans derived from Africa, the modern humans, but there was lots of interchange of genes between different groups. So that actually is what now makes most sense when we look into how human evolution functions. But this is also possible because we don't have, when changing, animals change their species status mostly due to moving out of the region or developing different adaptation within the same region, etc., etc. So these species are adapted to a particular environment, to particular ecological niche. When you look at humans, we have occupied all sorts of ecological niches, but not by changing our body structure. Some of it happened during, human evolution as changing of body structure. But then there is lots of arbitrary changes in human skull that happen because, grandpa had a big nose. Everyone in the family has a big nose. And there are 4 basic principles of evolutionary forces that act, right? So one of them is just founder effect. Another is bottleneck. The third one is selection. The fourth one is mutation. So you have these 4 forces. In humans, they're mitigated by human-derived culture. And when I say that, humans are specific in animal world, like possibly other animals have culture. It's not something that I would ever disagree with. The point is that primates are very variable, and they have lots of behavioral adaptations that you don't find in other lineage, in other groups, right? So they're defined by having, as a group, primates are defined by not having a defining character that's applicable to all, and not having any character that does not exist in any of them. So you can have lots of different variations in the primate. They're very behaviorally and morphologically flexible. So you have postural behavior that goes from anything, from quadrupedal to sitting to etc. Then you have also locomotor behavior that's different. You have social organization that's different. But one of the characteristics of primates is prosociality. And there are many different forms of it. In humans, social interactions become key to human adaptation. So this is a cultural must in a human group. You can find some, like stopalniks or some, hermetics that actually live alone, etc., etc. That's fine. But for a human, lots of it is associated with the group. Lots of our individual behaviors and our identities associated with the identity of a social group we belong to. And Marin has a really beautiful paper on that as well. So these things, combined with our absolute reliance on tools, is really what I would say, we are not just tool users. Crows can use tools, but they can live without tools. We cannot live without tools. And even more so today, like, turn the electricity off and everything falls apart, right? Except for socializing. That's the only thing that doesn't fall apart. But I mean, you don't have to have electricity. You start with sticks and stones, and it's all, sort of a natural development of tools as you go along, right? Because they become more complex, they become more versatile, they become more this and that, but they're always there, and we always have to use them. So externalizing, and plus you add fire to that, right? Because it allows you to do some things that you do not do otherwise. Chase the predators off is a good one. And all sorts of other things stalk around the fire, and we're like, when you think about our instincts and our like really hardwired, like, why do we like those fire pits? Why do we like those fireplaces? Like, it just, there is something about it, that actually speaks to the mind of a human. So what happens is that at some point in time, because if we want to define species in Middle Pleistocene, okay, we have to acknowledge that most of these species in Middle Pleistocene developed the same shared derived trait, and that's the big brain. For that to happen, you had to have an ancestor, the most recent common ancestor, that already had a big brain, or were developing a bigger than previously encountered brains. And there's one in Malcacontura in Africa. So this is really a good candidate. And I would really like to find more of that specimen, or maybe some complete skull or something like that. So with Bodoensis, it's close enough to that most recent common ancestor, but already kind of defined in what it might lead to. And one of the defining characteristics, we don't have a mandible. One of the defining characteristics of Homo sapiens is having this protruding mandible. One of the defining characteristics of Homo sapiens is having these, wide, on the top of the head is where our head is the widest. So we have this kind of a house-shaped. And if you like, for the older species, we have this barn-shaped kind of lower third. Neanderthals, it's in the middle. So, these are morphological differences that are like structural in origin and possibly relevant. And then there are morphologies that are, we don't really know what their relevance is, but in Bodoensis and in modern humans, you have this breach, and it's like in between the glabella and the rest of superciliary arcs, you have a little dip. And that's one of the things that does not show up in Neanderthals, does not show up in Homo erectus, which has more like a straight thing. So this is something that maybe is similar to Homo sapiens, but Bodoensis doesn't have the traits that define Homo sapiens because it has still this primitive shape of the back of the skull. To go back to why we chose Bodo Dar specimen, Bodo 1, it's just, it fitted the bill really well. It had the right trait that we could, that could separate it from the others. It had these other features that are similar to others. It had this developed large brain with a higher parietal bones and higher vertical dimension of the skull. So, and the arch temporal, it's had like lots of details that actually could, because it's relatively complete. The other thing that was really interesting is now we constructed a hippodyme. So this is all of the specimens that would fall into that species group. And we have put potentially some specimens from Europe and some specimens of Southeast Europe and Southwest Asia. And also we have put into that most of the preserved skulls from the time period into the group.
You certainly have a lot of research to be proud of, Mirjana, but what about future projects? Is there anything new coming up that you can tell us about?
Yes, we do have. We have a large project that's funded by Canadian granting agency, SSHRC. Plug in again, they're awesome. We have a huge project in the Balkans covering basically all of the Pleistocene as much as we can, with lots of excavations, new stuff, and new materials, and new also methods. But we also, in terms of Bodoensisis, like in 2023, we organized a session in Novi Sad, which you have seen in the news maybe lately, with invited colleagues. So we chose from around the world as much as we could. We chose people who are working on the Chibanian or the Middle Pleistocene. We called it Meet the Chibanians, as a kind of a fun way of speaking about this, to discuss morphological and paleontological variation of hominins in this critical time period, where all of these traits that really defined humanity, the prosociality, the tool use, the obligate tool use, become sort of entrenched into our lineage, no matter where humans are. So we wanted to discuss what this large amount of newly discovered and reanalyzed specimens tell us about, the diversity of different hominins in the Middle Pleistocene. And don't forget, we also have these very small ones. We have Homo naledi, we have Floresiensis, Luzonensis, and all sorts of other species that do not fit these large-brained hominins. So there is a lot of variation in Middle Pleistocene. We invited people who are active in the field, and we came up with one paper that defines basically what we have discussed at that symposium. And also an edited volume in paleoanthropology. Paleoanthropology is society-based journal, so it's a diamond open access. So I encourage everyone to publish there, because not only do you not pay for reading, you don't pay for publishing, but also it is ultimately owned and run by two societies. One is Paleoanthropological Society, the American one, and then the other one is ISHI, the European Society for Human Evolution. So these are run by professionals for professionals, and it's not for profit. So we have a whole volume of papers in that. So this is what Chris and I are editing currently. And then there is there is lots of prospective work. We're still working. I still have a project with my colleagues in Tanzania, and we're trying to find reasonable, sustainable, and long-term funding for that project, which is always an issue because they always want to give you money for 3 years, but in 3 years, you really cannot do much. You can just start the project, get the feel for it, and then start the PhD student, and then they drop off the line because you have no more funding. So we have to work on that. And we are also planning, Chris and I are planning another paper with our colleagues, again, with Peja and Predrag Radovic and Shiju Ewu. We're also planning another sort of revisiting Bodoensis after all of the comments and all of the ways in it which was disputed or not, to revisit why and what is the reason for that. We wrote a lot about taxonomy and the need for taxonomical rules to follow both the ethics, changing ethics, right? But also to follow changing scientific disciplines. Like we really cannot live with a 1817 concept, 19th century names, and 20th century understanding of archaeology or paleoanthropology in a 21st century changing and shifting sort of quicksand of the current scientific politics and policies. So lots to work on. Not most of it is like, my still favorite thing is finding bones and putting them back together and doing the conservation and doing the description and stuff like that. So I'm hoping for more of that.
Mirjana Roksandic, thank you very much indeed.
Thank you, Mark, for having me. This was such a pleasure.